especially on a very wet Saturday morning, first program of the day. I'm really honored to be here. I'm Robert Napton. I'm SVP and publisher at Legendary Comics, and a friend of Marv's, and grew up reading his comics, as I'm sure a lot of you did. So I'm really, really honored to moderate. And of course, the man needs no introduction, but I'll let him say hi.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to start. I was just telling Marv, and to prepare for the panel, I found some good photos and found a really good photo on his Facebook. So we're going to embarrass him early at the start here. What I want to talk about to start things is how Marv was a fan, like all of us, and came from fandom. So. That is Marv, according to his Facebook. And then this is your moment.
Yes, that was me.
And
hopeless.
No, I think this is great. I'd never seen this picture before. So, can you tell me about your beginnings? How you got into comics? So, obviously Superman was a big deal, as it is for a lot of people.
Essentially, I chalk up all my success to one thing: I'm lazy. And I say that because, in truth, I was at my friend's house one day. We were watching a TV show called Howdy Doody, which was a stupid name for a kids show, but it was very popular. And at the end, we'd normally get up, change the channel, this is before remotes, and to another show, but for some reason we just didn't get up. We just sat there, and the very next show on that network was The Adventures of Superman, which we had never heard of before. And we just watched it, and at the end it said Superman's based on the copyrighted character appearing in Superman and Action Comics Monthly. And we got up, we walked to the corner to the newsstand, and bought my first Superman comics because I had seen the show, which is very similar to what people do today. They see the movies, and then they want to break into the business, or they just become fans of it. So I became a diehard fan of it, and Superman was always my favorite character, but there were not a lot of characters back then in comics. Superheroes. There was Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Black Hawk. And that was it, in terms of superheroes. It took years before Marvel came in and all of the others came in as well.
It's really interesting, we'll get into this as we go, that you saw the TV show first and that led you to the comics. That's something I didn't know. A lot of people, as you say, are discovering things that way now. I have to ask you about the costume. Did you make this yourself?
No, the thing about that shirt, there was virtually no merchandising back then. The concept wasn't even heard of. But Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes, I think it was, had a special thing. If you sent them 10 box tops and whatever amount of money, 50 cents or $1, that shirt was it. That was the only thing. So I ordered it immediately. I ate far more cereal than I wanted to eat. But I had to get the shirt. Who cared if I was eating bad stuff in my teeth, because it was all sugar frosted. I just loved it, and we ordered it from them, and 8 weeks later it came, and I never got out of it.
That's so great. I love this when I found it. So we're going to jump forward in time a little bit. Actually, quite a lot. But before we talk about this image...
Oh my God, I've never seen that photo.
Oh, yeah. I did a little research, a little homework. Tell me about, prior to becoming a professional, you were doing fanzines, you were active in fandom. Could you just talk about what you did in fandom before you turned pro, as it were?
Yeah, fandom was just beginning at that particular point. I gotta say, let me just say on this photo that you're seeing, that was when you walked up to the DC offices. That was sitting behind the welcome secretary or whatever. That was on the wall right there. So that's the first thing you saw about DC Comics. anyway,
Fandom, just kind of what you were doing?
So I'm now buying every comic I can possibly afford. They were only 10 cents back then, so even with an allowance, I was able to buy pretty much everything. And hold on, I'm sorry, I get lost sometimes. So anyway, I started to buy everything, and then what happened was they put in the letter columns. So I started to write letters to the editor. And Julie Schwartz, who was one of the main editors of books I liked, also printed the addresses of the people who sent in, because he came from science fiction fandom, and he wanted to get people together. So I started to write letters to them, and they published them. And then immediately, within a week or two of the first letters that were published with my address, two fanzines came. Now, I had never heard of fanzines back then. I didn't know anyone read comics besides me, because nobody seemed to. And it was just, I read these two fanzines, and I was just fell in love with the whole concept, and I decided, you know, after about a year or so, I can do this. And I don't know what my parents were thinking, but they actually let me buy a ditto machine, which was not like a mimeograph, if you know what that is, but it's similar. And I printed, I did 4 different fanzines. I did Super Adventures was my superhero fanzine, and we published about 10-15 issues of that. Stories of Suspense was my horror fanzine. The Foob was my comedy fanzine, and then I did something called What The, which was an opinion fanzine. So I covered all the bases and published, went to the High School of Art and Design to become an artist in comics. My art was so good they all recommended I become a writer. So I stopped drawing pretty much back then, but I did go to the High School of Art and Design, which is the school that many of the professional artists went to, and obviously they have the talent. And it was pretty incredible, because there you met other people who drew, who liked stuff, because I took cartooning at High School of Art and Design. And then I became a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, and I taught junior high school art badly. Finally did the thing that I was meant to do, which is write stories, because I always came up with stories to draw. But I was able to control my stories better than I could control my art. And just pursued that religiously until they finally started, they were worn down and wanted me to shut up, so they started buying stuff.
And can you talk, I mean, I think it's really interesting, even when you were doing fanzines, you really felt that impulse to publish, to pull your ideas together, to make stuff at a very young age. You were in high school, so that was always there.
It was there because I kept seeing the other fanzines, and some of them had comics in them, and some of mine had as well. And I kept saying, I think I could do that. I can draw, I can write, why don't I just do it? And it started to work also. Once I started, some other fans came in. Like, there was this guy who sent in a horror story. His people sent in a horror story in prose. And I think his name was Steve King. Seriously, I published his first stories in my Stories of Suspense fandom.
So, yeah, I read that. That's amazing.
I'm forgetting his name now, but from Kiss, Gene Simmons of Kiss. And I don't remember this. This says how bad my memory is, but I don't remember this. But Gene Simmons says that he and I worked on fanzines together. Now, I remember his friends, but I didn't remember him.
Yeah, Gene says it happened, right?
I've worked with people that Steve Lealoha, who's a brilliant artist and inker, and he and I did regular comic strips for the fanzines, for my fanzines. We did something called John R. the Space Viking. That's thrilling, isn't it? But I worked with a lot of people who eventually became professionals. So I thought, you know, it was just perfect. Fandom was a great breeding ground for talent.
And I think it always has been and always will be, right?
Yeah.
So many of us start that way. Tell me about when you finally broke in and got hired by DC to do your first thing.
What happened was I started to do fanzines, as I say, and back then there were only DC and Marvel, and there were maybe 5 editors. So I would always send copies of my fanzines to those 5 editors, just to give it to them. And Joe Orlando, who was an editor at DC, got them and called me up and said, would you like to submit material to House of Mystery? Because he liked what I did in the fanzines, showing them the stuff. I said, yeah, submitted some plots. They took 1 or 2, and that's the beginning.
So one of your first big moments was co-creating Destiny for Weird Mystery Tales #1. I always say Weird Tales, but it was Weird Mystery Tales #1, with which you did with Bernie Wrightson. Could you tell me a little about Destiny and how that came about?
Yeah, essentially what happened was I was an assistant editor for Joe Kubert. He needed somebody when all the Edgar Rice Burroughs books came at DC, he needed someone to help him because he was going to be drawing it, and that meant he wouldn't have that much time to do some of the editorial work, so he asked for an assistant, and that was me. There weren't that many people trying to do this stuff back then, and I just thought that working under Joe Kubert, I'd learn an awful lot, and I really did. Anyway, so one of the first things they asked me as an assistant is to put together a new mystery book, but using material that they had bought but never published. And they bought a lot of mystery stories, and they bought a lot of that, and all of their books always had a host character: Cain, Abel, the witches, and some others. So when I got this assignment to go through all those unpublished stories, get the best ones, and I went, you know, all the other books have hosts. Look, can I come up with a host character? And they said, okay. And what they did was they gave me money for 1 page of art, and I asked Bernie to come up with a whole bunch of designs. We talked about, I had come up with the idea for Destiny, that his destiny was to tell the stories and all of this sort of stuff. And Bernie did about a half dozen different designs all on 1 page, because that's all we could afford back then. And I picked the one, and Destiny with the Book of Destiny and all of that. And I knew Bernie, because all the young beginning writers and artists, we get together once a month at Jeff Jones's, who was an artist, passed away unfortunately many years ago, at his house for what was called First Fridays. So the entire young industry of comic book writers and artists got together once a month. And so I knew Bernie fairly well from that, and it was easy to ask him, and he was delighted to do it. And you know the visual, because now Destiny's in the Endless with Neil Gaiman. Neil very nicely, he didn't have to, he called me up and said, I'm doing this new book called Sandman, and can I use Destiny as a character in that? He knew that I had created it, and as I say, DC owned it, so he didn't have to ask me, but he was very polite and very nice, and he said if I had said no, he would come up with something else, but he really liked the visual of Destiny, and I was thrilled to have somebody else take my characters and do something with them. And of course, he was brilliant.
Well, you answered my next question, which is about Neil doing that, but before we move forward, tell me about those gatherings and what it was like at DC in those days in the late 60s, and just the vibe, and what was it like amongst the young creators?
Well, you know, everyone was between, all the new talent was coming in, was between 18 and 23, something around that. We were all just starting at the same time. you know, it was always thrilling. We'd show off the new story of the new piece of art that was just sold, and everyone came. It was just a fun time. Jeff, we had the thing started at Jeff's place, and his wife Wheezy, who's Louise Simonson, now. So it was just a wonderful time of all of us so excited because we were the first generation of comic book fans who became professionals. The original generation of artists and writers were people who wanted to get into comic strips. They were all interested in that or into advertising or whatever else, and they found it easier to do comics. We were the first generation who loved comics, and we just wanted to do comics. That was our goal. And, you know, which is pretty stupid because none of us had a plan B if it didn't work out. I keep going, I'd be selling roses, you know, at the freeway entrances or something, because the only thing I was good for was writing comics.
That's amazing. So we're going to jump forward again. This is a picture from the 70s, around the time you joined Marvel. So can you talk a little bit about your move to Marvel in the early 70s, and we're going to get into some of the work you did there, obviously.
Well, I was an assistant editor at DC, and at some point DC had what was called the DC implosion. Some of you may remember hearing about that. And a lot of books were canceled, a ton of books were canceled, and they were starting over, and they eliminated many of the assistant editor jobs because they, you know, we were useless. It was, so I went over to, I discovered that Warren Publishing, they did Creepy, Eerie, and Vampirella, needed a new editor. And because I was Joe Cuba's assistant editor, when I went out to find out if I could do that, they assumed I knew what I was talking about. Thank goodness they assumed it because I didn't. But I'm at Warren buying stories, doing stuff like that, and I get a call from Roy Thomas at Marvel, and Roy says, we'd like to hire you to do, we're starting a black and white line of magazines, and we'd love to have you edit because you're an editor at Warren, and therefore you knew how to do it. And I was at Warren making a small living because they didn't pay very well, and Marvel called me, and so naturally I did the smartest thing possible. I said no. I just got the job at Warren. I didn't think it was fair to just be hired and then leave immediately. So, you know, we parted ways in terms of that, but we went up to, months later, we go up to Rutland, Vermont for the annual Halloween parade that some of you may have heard about. And Roy and I are sitting right next to each other, and he says, the editor that we hired to do the job had to leave because he just couldn't do it. That job is available again, would you be interested? This time I was. And it was a thrill to come over to Marvel. And I was already writing for Marvel, even though I was an editor at Warren. And I was working on the early issues of Tomb of Dracula. And had just done the Blade story, the original Blade story.
That's coming up.
And so I leave Warren, go to Marvel, and the very first book they asked me to proofread and edit is my Blade story. So I got to do that. That was fun, and I love it. I love the entire 8 years I was there.
Well, here's another picture which I took from your Facebook page, which is the Marvel bullpen. I mean, this is just incredible if you look at the names here. I mean, you're amongst the everyone's a legend on this page. So what was that like? You know, I mean, it was, there's Archie, there's George, Barry Windsor Smith. I mean, it just goes on and on.
It was, again, because we were all about the same age and we all loved the material, everyone would get together. We'd go out to lunch, we'd go out to dinner, we'd get together and play cards on Friday nights and, you know, be up all hours of the day. it was just a wonderful time because we all talked to each other and worked with each other, and there was no problem if one of the writers was stuck for an idea, someone else would help them. It wasn't like we were all territorial or anything. We really just loved it and wanted to help each other tell our stories. And that's how we learned how to do it.
Amazing. So you mentioned it, and there it is, Tomb of Dracula, which you took over issue 7, so this is the cover. And I read a quote from you, you said, yeah, I took over with issue 7, and by issue 11 or 12, it was you felt you were finding your legs with it. Could you just talk about, what this was like? And you obviously came from loving horror and...
Actually, it's strange. I had never seen horror movies.
Oh, really?
I'm a wimp. They scared me. I actually was not a big horror fan.
Okay.
Not in terms of movies, very much in terms of books. And short stories and horror and prose horror stories. I like that. And I loved that I had never seen a Dracula movie, and I still haven't.
Wow.
Not a whole movie, at least. And it was like, okay, so they offered me the Tomb of Dracula in several months. They said that we already booked through issue 6, and we want you to take over with issue 7. So I had a couple of months to think about what I wanted to do, which was very rare back then, because everyone was always late, but this particular thing worked out fairly well. So they asked me to work on the Tomb of Dracula, and I reread the book, which I had read previously in a comics version of Dracula, and really loved the idea that the book was not about Dracula. He's in like 80 pages of a 400-page book. It was about the people hunting Dracula. It was about how ordinary people felt the fear, felt the tensions, felt the problems, and how they dealt with this evil that was out there. But it wasn't about him because it wasn't narrated. It was never narrated. You never knew what Dracula was thinking. It was written in an epistolary form where it was letters, our cast writing letters to each other, or something like that. Police blotters, there'd be notices on that. They'd find a way to do it so none of the characters knew what Dracula was doing or why he was doing it, which made it more frightening in many ways. You had this villain, and that sort of informed me on how to do not only that book, but pretty much all the books that I've worked on, where how are these characters seen? How are they understood? How do you take the character and make somebody want to read about them, and they're not the big character in the book, making them interesting for the readers. So that's pretty much how I started to put together Dracula. I started to come up with ideas about the cast and not Dracula, and then slowly started to move into revealing a little bit more, but never in the entire history of all the years that I was on that book did we ever have Dracula explain anything or have him think. There were no thought balloons ever in that book from Dracula, because I did not want anyone having the slightest idea why Dracula was doing what he was doing. I wanted you to be able to be plunged in and be part of that process. I don't know if that makes sense. But
it totally makes sense. Well, Bram Stoker's novel even kind of has the letters and people talking about him. And that's kind of why it's still interesting, because we don't really know what was behind a lot of what he was doing.
And that allowed me to take it because I hadn't seen any of the movies. And once I got the assignment, I went out of my way to never see them, because I didn't want to be influenced by what Hammer Films did. I wanted to be influenced by Bram Stoker's novel only. And I think that's why the book, I think, was people enjoyed the book, because it was a very different take than the movies.
And you mentioned the character, a perfect segue, you mentioned the characters you created to deal with Dracula, and one of those is Blade. Round of applause for Blade. So, perfect example of what you were just talking about. You came up with this fascinating character.
It's really, he's a strange character in that I was not thinking about the character at this particular point. I was coming home, I was walking, and I swear to God, in 1 second, that character came to me as I'm walking home from work. I had not been planning to come up with any characters for Dracula to fight. I just hadn't gotten there yet. I was still playing with other stuff, but suddenly Blade's entire life and how he looked and what he wore and all of that stuff just came to me suddenly. It's only happened to me twice that a character came full blown to me.
Wow, that's amazing. Did you feel like when those couple of moments happened and with Blade, did you feel like, ooh, I've really got something here, or was it just another story for Dracula?
No, I felt there was something special about the character. I was not aware that there had never been a black vampire hunter. I just assumed I was coming up with, my stories, and I didn't know that had not been done before. I wanted a character that would be sort of the opposite of Dracula, who had some vampiric blood in him, because that's how he was born. His mother was pregnant and the vampire killed her. And the blood transferred that way to Blade. Now, I knew there was something special, which is why I used him a lot, and then at some point I went, I'm overusing the character, let me pull it away and think about him some more. But the reaction to Blade and my feeling about the character, I just loved him. And I just did a Blade story for Marvel. First one in 30 years, I think.
That's awesome. So you mentioned when you, this is very interesting to me, you mentioned you were editing and one of your assignments was to edit your own Dracula story when you got to Marvel. So was that something you were able to do pretty easily, like go wear those different hats, go from editorial to writing, and because that's not always easy for comic writers to go to editorial and then switch back and forth.
Yeah, whatever is twisted thing that's inside my brain, I'm very compartmentalized. I'm not pronouncing that right. So when I'm sitting in front of the typewriter back then, and I'm a writer, I'm thinking in terms of writing. When I'm at the office and I was editing, I was thinking of what works for Marvel, what doesn't work, even if it's something that I wouldn't do. But why are you doing this? What the characters are supposed to do in the future? You become driven editorially, and you just separate the two, because it's very important that you not take the writer side of you and move that into editorial. Because if you do that, you won't be able to make good decisions. That's for the company, not for you. When you're a writer, you worry about what you're doing. When you're an editor, you're worrying about the entire company, and you have to protect that. So I found that I was able to separate the two completely to the point that it's almost like you're two different people.
That's really fascinating. You have that discipline. Do you think that came from your time doing fanzines and things like that, or was it just something about you? You were able to do that?
No, when you're sitting there, I think it came from having been an assistant editor and Joe Kubert talking about, focusing on this and this and this and this, and to do that, you can't be thinking about the other stuff. So I learned so much more by working with someone and then paying attention to how he did it, and I was able to spread that to people after me as well. When I was the editor-in-chief and hiring new writers to take over or new editors to take over various things.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that before we go to the next slide. Your stint as editor-in-chief at Marvel, was that something you enjoyed? You kind of went back to writing more full-time after that, so I feel like that was a decision you had to make, sort of.
What happened was I loved working as the editor in the black and white magazines and then the editor-in-chief of the color books. Absolutely loved doing it, but Marvel was bought by a new company at that time, Cadence, and my job started to morph not from creative into business, and I have no knowledge of business. I'm not interested in business. I don't care about it. But and the hardest thing is having to negotiate salaries. I don't want to do that. I got into comics because I wanted to write stories, and so I finally said, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do it anymore. I'd like to get a contract just for writing, and I will work on the books, but I can't be an editor if the editor isn't being creative.
Right. That makes perfect sense. I'm glad you you did that. We all are. So your time at Marvel, many amazing characters, including Bullseye, who is a foil for Daredevil. Could you talk about creating Bullseye and just you talked about this with Dracula also. What makes an interesting villain? You've talked about this already, but I think it's something that goes through your work where you've created these just iconic villains.
Well, you have to think about what the hero is. Daredevil is a character who is blind, and he has this radar sense, which means he can see. I don't know. But he's blind, and his radar sense picks up dangers, sort of like Spidey's sense. And the thing is, how do you deal with that? So you have to think of it on a character level. So his radar sense, Daredevil's radar sense, could pick up if somebody is about to shoot him. He could pick up something if somebody tries to kill him with a knife. He can do that and he can work around. What if the character is 4 blocks away and has a gun that could shoot? He's not gonna be able to react until it's closer. So the idea was to come up with a character who can be a long-distance villain, because that would interfere with Daredevil's radar sense. He'd be too confused. He wouldn't be able to deal with it because his character, his personality depends upon that stuff. And if he can't do that, he's vulnerable, whereas in a close-up fight, he isn't. So,
You're exploiting
coming up with a
weakness.
character that fits the villain, that fits the hero, and creates the most problems for the hero. Because that's what's always interesting, is how is the hero going to deal with something? And Bullseye was a character that always stayed just out of range, out of radar range. Yeah.
It's fun that you were figuring out what's the weakness, right? And what's the kryptonite for this? For
but it has to make sense to the character. It has to make sense. I always go back to the very beginning, because it's one of those things that you try to figure out, why is this character good? In the very beginning, why the fans latched onto this particular character, and then you have to play all the problems that the character faces, all the villains he faces have to be designed to tax that particular character. It wouldn't be a good Daredevil villain would not be a good Fantastic Four villain.
So at this point in your career, you've been at DC, you've been at Marvel, and we're going to talk about a couple of other characters you created while you were at Marvel. Were you, at this point, you must have been like, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this. I mean, you must have felt like, okay, at this point, this is what I'm doing. I'm a comic book professional. Yeah. I'm creating. And that must have been kind of an exciting moment. You'd made it, so to speak.
As you saw that photo, I was a comics fan since I was a little kid.
Right.
And every so often you realize you're doing exactly what you wanted to do all your life. So you can't be angry at a lot of stupid stuff that goes on in the politics of stuff, because you're doing exactly the right job. And if you're spending your entire time complaining about this job that you wanted more than anything in the world, you're insane. You love it. You giggle. Go, I just created a villain.
That's great advice, because I think it's very easy in a corporate situation, even then and now, to get caught up in the machinations of like, oh my gosh, the politics.
Yeah, it's a wasted emotion to be angry at something that, if you think about it, can be solved real quickly without any angst or any problems. And if you're in a business that you absolutely love, there shouldn't be any problems. You know, yeah, you're gonna always have people causing problems or whatever else, but you have to remember where you are.
So you created Nova, and I just wanted to touch on Nova quickly. I just got the 15 minutes. I can't believe it. It's already 15 minutes. We haven't even gotten the Titans. Yeah, I know.
We just started like 10 minutes ago.
We need more time. But Nova came from one of your fanzines.
Yeah,
so just talk about that.
Super Adventures had the character's name back then was Black Nova, and the costume was 90% the same. None of the storyline is the same. He was an adult. He was a whole bunch of stuff like that. But I adapted the comic book version, my fanzine version, into the version that I did for Marvel.
That's awesome. So creation from your fan days made it into Marvel.
And they're now talking. I think one of the Marvel people said that they were in discussion on how to do Nova for the movies or something. It's really thrilling to see so many of the characters that DC and Marvel that I've done with my artists and such be used in other media as well. I'm not saying it can only be done in comics or it can only be done that. A good character should be able to transcend each medium that he goes into.
Absolutely, and I will definitely talk about that before we run out of time. Oh, here's John Carter Morris. I just threw that in there because I love Edgar Rice Burroughs.
I know I love Edgar Rice Burroughs, but I used to live on his property in Tarzana when I lived in Tarzana. He used, I think, on my property there's it was a hill, and there was a pergola on top where he used to sit and write.
Wow.
So yeah, I love the early Burroughs stuff, and I love John Carter specifically.
Wow, that's a whole story we have to talk about. That's really interesting that you were on the Burroughs property, but we have to have enough time to talk about the new Teen Titans, of course. Round of applause.
Yeah, I
All right. So this is the comic I started. I remember so vividly buying this. Obviously, so much has been said about it, and you yourself have said a lot. What was interesting, as part of my homework, I reread your introduction to the Omnibus, and you talk about how you and George were not writer-artists, you were co-creators, and the way you worked together. I mean, you know, I'm saying the obvious, but your collaboration with George is one of the all-time, you know, top 5 collaborations in the history of comics. What did you guys bring out of each other and that worked so well?
Well, first of all, we were friends. I worked with George when I was still at Marvel as well, and we were both doing various things. Working the way we did, we made a pact, sort of. I think it was unspoken, but if we disagreed on a concept that we came up with, if George came up with a concept that I didn't like, or I came up with a concept he didn't like, we wouldn't argue. We'd just get rid of it. We'd go and create something else, because it was just as easy to create something else. So there was never a moment of difference between us, because we never had to defend anything. We never had to fight. We never had to do any of that stuff. I knew what I wanted when I sold the Titans, which was before George got involved with it. I had worked out the characters, I had worked out all that stuff. And I knew the approach I wanted. This was a book about family. It wasn't a book about heroes getting together like the Justice League or the Avengers. They had just isolated characters who come together to fight crime. The Titans was going to be a family. And that meant a very different type of writing. And George and I both totally 100% agreed that we wanted to do that. And that was our focus the entire time on every single story.
The other thing that came out of rereading your introduction that I thought was a great point you made is that Raven, Starfire, Wonder Girl, you had a balance of male and female characters, and the female characters were actually the more powerful, which I sort of realized, but I think it was interesting the way you pointed that out, and that was at a time you know, when that wasn't at the forefront of comics, so you were ahead of your time in that sense. What was your thinking there? You just wanted the equal representation?
I didn't see, my favorite Marvel book as a book was Fantastic Four, single heroes, Spider-Man. And I lost track, I'm sorry.
The female balance between male and
as
female.
much as I love the Fantastic Four, I had a problem with Sue Storm because what's her big power? She turns invisible. So what, you know? Yeah, they gave her a force field later, but these weren't. Why were the female characters not being used? Why were they just merely window dressing in the book? And you know, I grew up at a different time. I didn't grow up in the 20s and 30s like the first batch of people did in comics. I grew up in the 60s, and it was a very different philosophy and a very different approach. And also I went to the High School of Art Design, and half the artists there who would be becoming professional, we did female or black or Latino or something else. So why not have every race, creed, and color? Because their fans are going to be out there who are every race, creed, and color. It was just so natural to me that I didn't even think otherwise.
That's great.
Doing the right thing doesn't matter.
Well, I think it does in 1980, because I was a pretty conservative
With
film.
Titans, as I said, I had come up with the characters, and I was up at Marvel for some reason. George was there, and I was speaking to him, and I said, I just came up with a new version of the Teen Titans. Would you be interested in drawing it? I'm asking a guy at the Marvel offices if he'll do it as you say. And he said, yeah, can I also do Justice League? And I said, I'm sure we can get something worked out, whatever. He said, I just want to really do Justice League. And then what happened was we started with Titans, and he fell in love with the whole book because it was the first time that he was being brought into the creative process. I may have come up with the characters and all of them and the origins and all of that stuff, but the way he drew them gave them further life that I could not do, you know, because he would have the characters posed the right way. He understood the characters intrinsically the same way I did. And it was like the same mind, but taking it from two different angles. One on literary, one on artistic.
So great. Now you guys are in at the heyday. You created another amazing villain.
I recognize that.
Once again. So what was if you could give us a minute on his creation.
Well, as I said when we were talking about Blade, I said that there were two characters. It was only the second time that ever happened to me that I created a character instantly. The whole character came together. The second character was Deathstroke. Every element of the character came together at that point.
That's amazing. Iconic. I'm going to go a little quicker now because time is pressing, but you did something that I had never, as a reader, I had never had in a comic. You actually evolved the character. So I was a Robin kid, and I was like, wait a minute, now Robin is Nightwing, and he's older. So that was amazing. You're about to write a little, I was reading this week, you're doing a little Nightwing thing for the 40th anniversary. Can't believe it's 40 years. So talk to me about quickly the idea of evolving Dick Grayson and recognizing that he was no longer 8 years old.
Let me start by saying something that will blow your mind. In 4 years, just 4 years, Dick Grayson will be Nightwing longer than he was Robin.
Wow, that does blow my mind.
It's sort of hard to believe because it's Batman and Robin, but Dick will pass him in just 4 years. I was not writing, Teen Titans was not a book about 12-year-olds or 13-year-olds or 14-year-olds like the previous versions of Titans were. In my mind, they were 18, 19, and even 20. That's why we eventually took off the word teen. It was important that all the characters be older because I wanted to write about real emotions and real character stuff. And George was as well. And we had Robin, and Robin was no longer in the Batman book at that particular point. And I really hated the whole concept of a Robin, a 19-year-old wearing those silly green shorts. It just looked all wrong to me. And went up to DC. Oh no. At the same time, the Batman editor wanted Robin back, but he wanted to make him young again. And I went, unfortunately I had some power there because Times was selling so well. And I said, I don't really want that, but here's an idea. Why don't you take Robin? I don't care about Robin in the slightest. I want Dick Grayson. I want that character. I want the adult character, the character 1 year shy of being 20, 21. And that allows you to come up with a new Robin and to advertise to the fans and let them be part of something that's never happened before, which is the kid partner becomes the adult hero. And they saw it was a positive plus for both of us. I would get Dick Grayson, who was already the leader of the Titans, but now I could really make him the age he should be. And George just loved the idea and designed the Nightwing costume. We went through a million names on the character. I wasn't going to do Nightwing originally because it was one of the first thoughts that we had, but because Nightwing was the name of a character in the Superman book, he was a Kryptonian character, Nightwing and Flamebird. And finally I went, there's no better name. He actually fits it perfectly on all ways, and I had to come up with I'm Dick Grayson saying I've been influenced by Batman and Superman, and this is an honor of both of them. So, yeah.
It was a landmark moment. I mean, as a reader, I remember it so vividly. I was like, this is, wow. It is like, something's changing and it was so significant. Well, I'm going to scroll through a little quicker because time is of the essence. Your guys' output was incredible. You were doing a second book. I still don't quite understand how you guys did that, but
that drove us crazy doing two of them. It was a major mistake. Yeah.
But the second book was unique, and the art style, you know, with the pencils and the not inks, yeah, and just the way it was done was really, it felt different. So was there creatively a different opportunity with the second book?
Yeah, they were not. This book was not submitted or to the Comics Code whatsoever, so we could write a little bit more adult stories, which was where the Titans was leading to anyway. It was just really hard writing two Titans books a month and keeping track of all of it within continuity, and I had to think about a year from now and a year in the past, and it was hard.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah.
So, we can't run out of time before, you know, as a little side project, you and George sorted out the entire continuity of 50 years of the DC universe. So, can you talk a little about Crisis on Infinite Earths?
I was writing the letter columns for Green Lantern, which is the book I was writing at, one of the many books I was writing at the time. And a fan wrote in saying he didn't understand DC continuity. Now, DC sales at that particular time were not very good. Marv was outselling them something like 4-1 back then, and we needed to do something to make, because DC had so many great characters, but they just weren't getting out there, they weren't being done correctly. And again, one of those things, we were heading to a convention in Pennsylvania, and I'm very deadline conscious, and I was waiting. I got to Penn Station to take the train down an hour before we had to leave, and the other people were a little late, so they finally, I'm sitting there waiting for everyone else to show up so we could take the train to Pennsylvania, and I started thinking about that letter, about how do we fix the continuity, and I had an hour before anyone else showed up, and I worked out pretty much the entire concept of what Crisis would be and the storyline and how it would work, and submitted it. Talked to Jeanette Kahn the following Monday, who was the president of Marvel, president and publisher, And she loved the idea because we needed something big. We needed to make a real statement that DC was changing, that we were doing different type of material. It's no longer the Superman from the 1950s, even now, 1985. So, you know, I pitched it then to George. I was working on it, I pitched it to George, and George was so busy doing other stuff because he wanted to do Wonder Woman and things like that. And but every time we get together on a Titan story, he would say, so how's your Crisis project? Well, it didn't have a name then, but how did your project coming? And I would tell him, and then finally he went, okay, I can't stand it. Do you have an artist yet? I said, no. He said, can I do it? I said, are you joking? Yes, a million times. Yes, you're the only person who could do this. I've been waiting. You know. So that's how it started. So I had the first 4 issues already worked out and in big detail, and then the rest of the issues in outline form, and we were able to then just make each issue work even better once we had the visual concepts going on at the same time.
Well, we're out of time, but I have to take it back to the picture of the little boy in the Superman outfit in this cover. So at this time, you must have been like, wow, I've really come full circle. I mean, you wrote one of the most iconic Superman stories, among other characters, but I think Crisis definitely.
It was one of those things that I think the only thing that stopped me from giggling and saying I'm doing exactly what I wanted on this was the hardest assignment in the universe. Because I was the editor as well as the writer, and I had to deal with every other writer at the company and every other editor at the company, and it was just a nightmare to do. It was the hardest thing just to navigate without, even before we got to telling these stories, it was just a real hard thing to do. And I look back at it, and because I read it for the first time since I wrote it just a couple of years ago, and I went, gee, this really works. Because while I'm in the midst of doing it, it was just a nightmare because it was the hardest thing in the world to keep track of that complex a story with 400 characters and all of these other stuff, and it all had to make sense. Everything had to make sense to people who had not read DC Comics, because we were trying to get the Marvel readers to look and say, oh, DC has good books too. And so it had to be clear to them while not insulting the DC readers. And I had like a million things that were on my mind all at the same time with that particular book. But in retrospect, it was one of the best things I could have ever done. And it fit into, the story worked. And I was shocked with that. I just never realized how popular the story would be, because I always thought it was leading to the new DC. This wasn't the special thing. It was where the new line of books was going to be, all the new stuff was going to be. And I thought Crisis would be forgotten very quickly and supplanted by all the other books at DC. But it turned out that people really liked the Crisis book, and I'm so thankful for it.
Well, it was iconic, as is so much of your work. Unfortunately, we could go another hour, but we're out of time. But Marv will be around the convention. You're gonna.
I'm actually, they just moved me. I'm in a different. I'll be
304B.
304B.
I'll be at 304B. Come by, and I'll be signing from 1:30 to 4 p.m. today. So you won't see me otherwise.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was an honor. And, we appreciate you being here. Thank you.